Aloha and welcome to Making the Most of Implicit Bias Training. My name is Susan Serrano, and I'm faculty and the Associate Director of Kuhuliau Center for Excellence in Native Hawaiian Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law. Thank you to everyone here for joining us today. Today's panel is the fourth in our series, and as you know, that series is entitled Confronting Racial Injustice, Achieving Racial Equity in Hawaii. And it is presented as a partnership between the Judiciary's Committee on Equality and Access to the Courts, the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, and the Hawaii State Bar Association's Civic Education Committee. The racial justice movements of 2020 and the events at the US Capitol just this past January cast a bright light on explicit racial injustice in the United States. But researchers in the field of social cognition have long known that alongside more explicit or conscious bias, implicit biases and attitudes can influence how we perceive and interpret information and how we interact with and make decisions about others with real-world consequences. And this often occurs even when we claim to lack any animus toward members of other social groups. And as a result, many organizations nationwide, as well as here in Hawaii, are offering implicit bias trainings. This panel today will explore ways to strengthen those trainings. How can we better ensure that these trainings are thoughtful, critical, and make lasting organizational impacts? How can we create space for the conversations that arise and the actions that are needed once biases are recognized? And how do we situate these trainings as part of a larger and long-term collective response to deeply rooted bias within our institutions and structures? Our panelists will explore some of these questions today. So now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce the panel. First, Louise Ng is a partner at Denton's Honolulu office, and she will be serving as the panel moderator today. Louise's practice focuses on helping businesses, nonprofits, and individuals resolve disputes. She has served on several nonprofit boards and in many leadership positions, and received the Patsy T. Mink PAC Award for her work on women's health issues, as well as leadership awards from Hawaii Women Lawyers, Hawaii State Bar Association, the YWCA of Oahu, and others. Next, Justin Levinson is a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law. He is a leader in the field of implicit bias and the law and an expert in psychological decision-making in the legal system. His scholarship has appeared in several major law journals, and he was the lead editor of the book, Implicit Racial Bias Across the Law, published in 2012 by Cambridge University Press. He's the founder of the Culture and Jury Project, an interdisciplinary research collaboration focused on facilitating the study of human decision-making in the law. Jamila Jarman is in-house counsel at Elemental Accelerator, a clean tech growth accelerator in Honolulu. She has practiced in the areas of civil litigation, poverty law, and environmental law, and has worked with many community organizations. In 2019, she was named one of Hawaii's most influential young leaders by Pacific Business News, and was also selected as a Pacific Century Fellow as part of a cohort of emerging leaders creating innovative solutions to Hawaii's problems. Finally, Keahi Davis is the Education Director at the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center. He holds a Master of Education in Learning Design and Technology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he has designed instructional programs and conducted trainings focused on implicit bias. I thank our esteemed panelists for taking the time to share their insights with us today, and I will now turn it over to Louise.
Thank you, Professor Serrano, and thank you to our panelists as well as to our audience. To orient our audience to the speakers, my first question is going to be to our eminently qualified panelists from diverse backgrounds. How would you describe how your work or past experiences inform your approach to implicit bias training today? And we'll start with Keahi.
Okay. So I think for me, work and past experience, life experience, have informed how I approach this subject. I mean, as an African American man, I've experienced firsthand how race in America really does affect how you're perceived. I've been on, the other end of, in situations where I've had guns drawn on me by the police. For no other reason that I was driving a car in Santa Monica. Yeah, it's, my grandfather was killed in the small town that he lived in Arkansas because he was an outspoken black man. So I've intimate knowledge of that type of racism there. But then going forward, growing up in America, just starting to realize that, I was part of an out group, so to speak, when you think of the idea of America. And then seeing how that idea was perpetuated throughout the culture. And I wanted to do something about that. And it's kind of like this idea that simmered in my mind for years and years and years. And then how do I contribute to interrupting that sort of bias, so to speak? And so, of course, I'm involved in civics education, and that day of how do we all kind of like come together for the common good. And then for this particular idea with implicit bias, I really got going with it when I was in grad school, and I worked on a project on a training module for implicit bias. And I really kind of dove deep into it and started to look more at the psychology behind all of this sort of stuff. So that's kind of like where my passion is with that going forward. Yeah, and that kind of sums up what it is for me.
Thank you for sharing, Keahi. That's very powerful. Next, we'll feature Jamila and her story.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Of course, there's the personal and there's the professional. So personally, as you can see, I'm a Black woman, also a Black woman who grew up in Hawaii. So this is something that has been put upon me, basically because of just being. So that is a way that I come to this. I also think about it as working in a professional setting as well in the legal community. This is somewhere where you do see it. As the Young Lawyers Division president, my entire year was really I looked at the makeup of our judicial sector, the lawyers, the judges, et cetera. And that's something that I've been keenly aware of since basically since I've decided to become a lawyer. And then my work at Elemental Accelerator, I work in innovation, which if any of you know around about innovation, it's very much so white and male. And my organization is about looking at the equity and the access to all people to be innovators, to be entrepreneurs. And so we also walk the walk. So in providing different ways that we look at our hiring process, looking at how we look at our suppliers, et cetera, I have gotten even deeper into this work around implicit bias and how those biases can come into different sorts of areas of work.
Thank you, Jamila. And we look forward to getting into the practical aspects later on. And Justin, what about you?
Hi. I come to this as a researcher. I started researching implicit bias around 2005 here. And I've been doing various empirical studies around implicit bias, mostly in the legal system, but also beyond ever since then. And so the way I come at this is looking at how has research developed and then how is society reacting, right? So just this panel, for example, how did we come together and why is there an audience here that's fairly sizable, right? This is kind of how I've been looking at the effect of implicit bias research and how society responds to it. And so that's kind of the conversation that interests me.
Thank you. My next question, just to sort of ground the discussion, is just to put it into context. What, we all know about outward racism and the like, but what is meant by the term implicit bias, and why is implicit bias training important? And maybe we'll start with Keahi because of his background in designing curriculum.
Okay, So implicit bias, as opposed to explicit bias. Implicit biases are like attitudes or stereotypes that affect a person's understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And that's a really important thing to realize, that these are unconscious things that are happening. They're in the background, right? And so while we may have egalitarian views that we can speak about and that we consciously believe we're doing, there's so much that has affected us as we've grown up, be it, associations within our family, within the community that we live in, what we're seeing in the media and things like that. Those things kind of build up in our mind, and they're in our subconscious there. And we kind of act on those. And implicit bias is just that. It's acting in a way that is unconscious, but may be different from your conscious attitudes for a given group of people. So I don't know if anyone wants to add something to that, or.
I can try to add on to that. Maybe taking the angle of why are they important, right? And which is also, it's also important to say, why is explicit bias important? The innovation of implicit bias research does not set aside the need to think about people who are actually willing to express their animus towards certain groups. And my research indicates that people are still willing to do that. And I think we all know that. So I just want to kind of say that we will be focusing on implicit bias mostly today, but that doesn't mean that explicit bias goes away. And I think we've all seen that in our recent history. I would also like to maybe add, what about implicit bias here, right? And why is implicit bias important in Hawaii? And I think Jamila talked a little bit about connecting the self, to her professional experience, and also implicit bias here. There's plenty of research to indicate that we are not better. We may be different in some ways. So I did a study that showed that we harbor strong implicit and explicit anti-Micronesian biases here. And when you run that study on the mainland, it doesn't show up the same. So we may have some nuances in our biases that are different, but we absolutely have plenty of and strong implicit biases here as well.
And I'll just come up and kind of just add a little bit more. Just thinking about how implicit bias is not necessarily conscious. I push back a little bit more on that, thinking it is very conscious. Even though it's implicit within you, and you're not explicitly trying to do it, you are consciously doing it because you are doing it. And also thinking about and doing implicit bias, and I know we'll get into the training, but a lot of folks will say, well, I didn't intend to do it because it's an implicit bias, but just because you didn't intend to do it doesn't mean it did not have an effect. So I think it's really important to also remember that it seems like implicit bias is like the light kind of bias, but it is just as traumatic as explicit bias, and the intent is there and it does harm.
Thank you, all of you. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to try to bridge the gap from a psychological perspective. Psychologists talk about implicit bias being automatic. And I think that's really kind of what Keahi's talking about. It can be conscious and automatic, and it can be something that we can interrupt if we learn how to do it. And I also wanted to highlight what Jamila was saying, in the sense of, I think it goes to the point that hopefully we can talk about later, which is who's responsible for it, right? I think Jamila's view on that just came out, but if we can take responsibility for our implicit biases and recognize that whether they're automatic or not, we are doing them, then that can motivate and shape the way we think about how do we interrupt the harms that we're causing through it.
Thank you. Any other comments, or we'll go on to the next one, which I think is going to be people want to hear about. So there is a renewed interest, as we all know, in developing implicit bias trainings that are meaningful. And we've seen that concern in some of the pre-event audience questions that have come out. In your view, what are the key considerations for designing an effective implicit bias training? Justin, you want to start off on that one?
Okay, I'm happy to give it a first shot. I mean, I would say the first thing is don't do it to fake it. Don't do it because somebody told you to do it. I mean, if somebody tells you to do it, you should do it. But don't do it to excuse yourself or your organization from anything, right? Do it because you are motivated to take on the consequences of a society that manifests these kinds of implicit and explicit biases and have harms associated with them. And if you frame a successful implicit bias response for an organization, not in terms of I need to do this or mandatory training or you should do this, and instead you frame it as a question of how are we responsible for perpetuating harms, and what should we as an organization be doing it, and me as a leader, what should I be doing, or whatever your role is. I think that's a better way to think about it. So I think kind of my first caution is, watch out for the people just going through the motions, and also watch out for the message that it's not that it's not your fault message. That's a message that, as a researcher, researchers in this field noticed maybe about 10 years ago, this kind of the field of diversity, inclusion, equity trainings were starting to get really popular. And one of the big themes of those trainings in early years tended to be that it's not your fault training. And I personally think that's a very unhelpful way to frame trainings, because as a society, whether or not we can target who's at fault for every little piece of where this comes from, as a society, this is what we are doing, and we are perpetuating these biases, whether automatic or not, through our actions and causing harms because of them. So that's kind of the initial way I would look at the question.
I think the other thing too is to set the expectation that implicit bias training should, I think for the most part, make you uncomfortable. It should put you in a frame of mind that, yeah, you've got to realize that you do have biases, and that those biases that you have may be harming other people or have harmed other people. So it shouldn't be something you just go into, hey, I'm going to sit in a meeting today, I'm going to do a training today, on an implicit bias, and I'm going to be okay after this. No, the idea is that when you're designing training, when you're talking about implicit bias, you should have that, I don't know if you want to say warning, so to speak, that we're going to be dealing with things that may make people uncomfortable, or should make people uncomfortable going forward. So, and then being aware of that, then you're much more willing to maybe acknowledge that discomfort, acknowledge the shortcomings that you have, and then be willing to work towards interrupting or minimizing the effect that it has on other people.
I think in addition to that, it's really important that you really do just start at the design aspect of things. Who are you going to be working with to do this implicit bias training? Do they take the time to get to know your organization, its culture? Because it's not one size fits all, because we're all coming at this from different places. The people in your organization are all starting at different places. The uncomfortableness of the training is going to be different for different people, because some people are the people who are perpetuating this bias, and others are the ones who are being affected by it. So you really need to take the time and make sure you have someone who is willing to facilitate and take that time to design the right thing for your organization. And then it's not just stopping at that training, but what's the next step? What are the next steps? Because if you just do the one training, you're just checking a box, and that's not helpful to anyone. We are here because we have not wanted to actually do the work, and this is actual work that people have to do. In addition, I think that training has to also encompass history. We are here because of history. History plays a role in all of that we do. It's why you need to have a facilitator of this training who understands the history of your place, the people who are coming to your training, and can really give you that focus and understanding of the why, so that it is another tool to help break down the implicit bias. Because we're of course looking at it from implicit bias in the workplace, but these live in the world as well, and they live in the world through different factors, different ways, like redlining, et cetera. So if you don't know that history, you also are not going to understand the why and how to dismantle the programming that we all have.
I mean, I would just add to that. I think Jamila's exactly right. Just in terms of first steps, right? How to get there. Yeah, yes, have the first training, right? And then when you're doing it, as Jamila suggested, ask who's going to do the training, how are they going to do the training, what do they care about, and why are they doing trainings like this within our particular organization? Each organization is going to have different needs and risks, right? So if you say, how does your organization perhaps perpetuate certain harms that could be linked to implicit or explicit bias, those are going to be unique to your organization. You know, the criminal justice system has a lot of different challenges, like the ones that Keahi mentioned and many others, has a lot of different challenges than the corporate sector, where we're talking about innovation and entrepreneurship and who are the players there, right? They all have their shared causes, but you would have to approach them not in the same way. So I do think as a starting point, it's really important to get somebody in who gets that and can kind of get their hands dirty. And it's also important that you as leaders are willing to ask the right questions and that you want to bring people in. I remember being part of a team that went to a Fortune 50 company around 2010 with a couple of professor friends of mine, and they asked us, can you come in and innovate something to work on implicit bias? They wanted to be leaders. And we went there with a really aggressive proposal about how we were going to try to understand implicit bias within their organization. And it required asking the kinds of hard questions and making people uncomfortable, like he said. And ultimately, they didn't want to work with us. And they wanted to work with somebody who'd been, 4 decades of kind of consultancies and diversity training. And they just came in and did a one-off thing and then disappeared. And they wanted to check the box and say, look at us, look what we did. And ultimately, I think that's probably more harmful than doing nothing. So that's just one little thing I want to add.
I'm looking at a couple of questions that came up in the chat and the question and answer, so I'll just throw them out there. There's been talk, for instance, of interrupting bias interrupter. Maybe you can address that as well. And somebody also asked, making the case for it. An entity, an organization might say, well, why should I do it? What is the harm if you don't do it?
Well, I think to me, it's obvious the harm if you don't do it is that you're perpetuating the biases that exist there, right? So if you are making those steps and there's no way for you to go about interrupting the bias, you're going to perpetuate it going forward. So I think Jamila is going to be speaking a little bit about this and what they're doing, and just simple things as like, if you're conducting an interview, if you're looking at a resume, what are the things that you're looking at there? What are the associations that you're making with the name that appears on the resume, with the school that they went to? Is it because of a particular school that you're going to feel an affiliation to that person or an aversion to that person? Is the name because it sounds like, oh, this name is unfamiliar to me? Is it going to be something that sparks your curiosity, or is you going to say, no, I don't want to deal with that person? These are things that in order to be able to interrupt those types of behaviors, you have to acknowledge that the bias exists. And that's part of what the training is ongoing training, I should say, is going to accomplish.
Yeah, and I would add for the why behind it. It's one, I didn't say this before, but you also need to have like buy-in of leadership wanting to be accountable, vulnerable, and ready to do this. But it's also going to help you retain talent. If people are comfortable in doing the work they're doing with you and feel respected and feel like they belong, they will stay. And places that do not have a culture that is accepting lose great talent because they are unwilling to do the work to keep that talent and to make sure everyone who comes through their doors belong.
a good corporate answer. That was the problem of that Fortune 50 company. We went there to do the pitch and we said, what are your problems? And they said, well, we don't have a problem with hiring. We have a problem with retention. And we all looked at each other like, like, of course you do, right? So it is, I mean, that is kind of one of the, if you have a retention problem at your organization, that's a good indicator that you're doing something wrong. Also, I would just say in terms of interrupters, the first thing maybe that's worth doing is for each person to try to think about areas of discretion in their own domain, right? So whatever you do, when is it that you make a decision or a judgment about person that matters? So the hiring context was one that was brought up, right? If you're a prosecutor and you're thinking about what crime am I going to charge, right? Am I charge this person and for what crime? Are you affected by their mugshot? And why is the mugshot even in there? So that's an example. In the corporate context, it's the resume, right? Does there need to be a name on a resume? Can you have a software system that filters that out? And there are things like that. But the discretion element for each person's job is really important. And it's also a very private thing too. So it's something you can take ownership of. You can ask yourself, when am I making judgments about people? And then you can keep track. You can have like your little secret notebook or whatever it is. And you can jot down every time. I've told this to judges before, right? Because you can keep track of how you rule on a particular type of motion for what kind of person. You may think that you're justified time A, time B, time C, time D. And then all of a sudden, when you look back a year or two later, you and only you know what you've done. And you can see it. You might not even catch it otherwise. So you have to kind of take ownership in a reflective way over your own role. And I think that kind of creates the motivation to then ask, for that problem that I just created, or at least perpetuated, how do I isolate on the interrupter for that problem?
And I've seen a number of questions pop up. Thank you, Justin. But another question, even though we're talking about, this is part of a racial equity series, implicit bias, the questions are, is it broader than that? Are there other types of biases besides racial that should be addressed?
Keahi, did you want to jump in? You can go.
Oh, no, I was going to say, of course, there are other types of biases. If you're talking about gender, if you're talking about sexual orientation, if you're religious affiliation, the spectrum is so big. And I think for folks, we're going to be putting in maybe in the chat a link to the Harvard implicit association test or implicit bias test. They have a range in them that you can look at and you can take, and it would be pretty enlightening, I think, for you to realize, like, wow, you might think, oh, I want to retake that because it doesn't mesh with how I think of myself, But again, the tests are designed to get at that subconscious sort of take on things. So
another issue. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add one little thing. Sorry, which is that we have studied those types of biases here as well, right? So I was part of a study in around 2010 that studied implicit gender biases in the legal profession here, and we looked at how people automatically associated judge with male and paralegal with female, and those were law student participants, right? So and I've piloted that at different law firms and found similar results. So that's just one example. It's not even that hard to test these things, but there are many of them.
Yeah, you touched on an issue. I think that's important too, is like how is that manifested in Hawaii? Some people say, oh, we're a melting pot. And others, how do you address that? What are the biases that are particular to this place that need to be addressed?
I can jump in there. Yes, melting pot, there are a lot of different folks here. Race shows up in Hawaii differently, but anti-Blackness is all around the world, including in Hawaii. White supremacy is something that has been perpetuated throughout the world. And so those are things that definitely are having an effect on the way that we operate as a society here in Hawaii. So you can't have the conversation of oh, do we have bias here? Do we not? It's very clear if you look at the structures we have in our society that there is bias, there is anti-Blackness, white supremacy reigns supreme. And it's why we have to talk about history. It's what it is. Like, you have to think about the overthrow of this kingdom and who did that overthrow. It was white supremacists, if you read the history and understand that. And then you look at all the structures that have been built. So you can't divorce it just because we have a melting pot of people here and cultures here and this wonderful community, because we still have the underpinnings of white supremacy that tell us the Blacker you are, the less you are. And we see that in our Native communities. We see that with Black folk who come here, and we see that with anyone who is on a darker spectrum.
Yeah, I think within the museum space, say for the Judiciary History Center, and this is museums across the world actually, are now, one of the terms they're using are decolonizing, the museum space. And what it is addressing that white supremacist point of view that for generations kind of like permeated the museum area, right? Where it was that point of view that so Western European mindset, looking at different cultures and everything as other, and how they were going to represent them in the museum space. And now the movement is to like shake off that representation and say, if you're in a space like we're in Hawaii, and I'm in a museum space talking about Hawaiian history, let's look at the real history. Let's look at the racist ideas that brought about the end of the kingdom. Let's look at the racist ideas that sort of started to build up this, what was, provisional to republic government to territorial government to state government. And how do those ideas exist today in our society? So we look at the criminal justice system. We look at, why is it that so many, disproportionate number of Native Hawaiians are in prison as opposed to their numbers in the population? Why do we see that the same with African Americans? Why do we see that, with folks from Micronesia as well? So to ask those questions, to look at the history, to, in this sense, that effort to decolonize is like that interrupter in that museum space that I'm dealing with on a regular basis. So.
Another question that came in, is there a one-size-fits-all implicit bias training? I think you've kind of addressed that, but thoughts on that? Can we just buy a module from somewhere?
I know a lot of people who don't like sports, and sometimes they say, sit down and watch a baseball game with me for like an hour. And they're maybe 40, 45 years old. Like, it doesn't work. You can't just undo something that's formed over a lifetime in an hour. And here you have something really harmful that's been created by our society and that has been perpetuated uninterrupted. And so there's definitely not one size fits all. And even if there were, I would say maybe like, it's not a bad thing to educate yourself, and like that Harvard website that Keahi suggested people check out, it's a great resource, right? Like, it's not one size fits all by any means, but it doesn't hurt to have a lot of resources available. But that is just, that's just to educate yourself and to begin to get comfortable with what's happening and really understanding it. But no, absolutely not. But yeah, there are educational tools, and we should lean heavily on those because they are helpful.
Yeah, and I think just to reinforce what Jamila was saying earlier, you got to know your audience, right? You can't just do a blanket thing for everyone and expect that, oh yeah, this is going to work, for group A, the same thing is going to work for group B. Not at all. You have to do that analysis of the structure, the system that you're going into, the people that are involved in that, the stakeholders, all of that sort of stuff comes into play when you're trying to creating a training module, so to speak, for this issue.
And I'll just add that there's a lot of attorneys, people in the legal field here. You would not present the same argument to the same judge or jury because you've done it before. You would think about who you were talking to. You would know your audience and try to tailor it as much as possible. So thinking about that in terms of like profession, this is the same sort of thing. And as Justin said, this is something that is deeply ingrained. So it's not going to be this one-time thing that undoes it all. But there are some aspects of a training that you should be looking for that can possibly be helpful, like having history as part of your training. If that training does not include history, it's probably not a training that is going to give you a full enough picture of what you need to do. So really understanding and having the ability to see what are the aspects of what people are doing. And if there's something missing, being able to ask that question and having that dialogue to make sure it is right for you. And there's always going to be a right for you and not a right that works for everybody.
Another question before we leave this and get into, how you make this long lasting and effective in the organization, is that, is there a way to build in, or is it effective to build into implicit bias training, training that teaches about basic relationships, communication, and that type of sort of basic human behavior and relationship issues, awareness? Is that part of it?
I think at the start of any sort of implicit bias training, you actually have to set ground rules so that it is a safe space for individuals. So I don't necessarily know if there's a particular type of communication aspects that you need to have learned into a system, but you do need to have like rules of engagement. You need to start with respect of everyone and where they're coming from. That does not mean that you discount anything that might be said that might be harmful, but you also have to make sure that you have these barriers, these ground rules, these agreed upon rules of engagement in order to create the space that you can actually have the worthwhile conversation, and making that explicit and making sure that leadership also is modeling that sort of behavior.
Any final comments before we leave this topic and move on to how we make this long lasting and effective in an organization? Okay, well, I think a lot of people also ask, okay, so we've had the training, we've talked about training. How do you ensure that, it can lead to positive, constructive change in a workplace or an organization? One of the pre-event questions was, how do you change a culture? How do you change a culture of bias in the workplace? And so thoughts on that. And I know two of you have actually had to, look at how you implement it in the workplace. Well, probably all of you, but I'm thinking Jamila and Keahi in particular, although all of you have something to say about this. Jamila, do you want to start off?
Sure. So implicit bias is one of the training is one of the tools. There are many tools. We've talked about the different tools that there are, but it's also, as a tool, you can't just do it by itself in a vacuum. So you also need to look at what are the other things in your organization that could be audited. It's kind of what I think of it. For my organization, we've looked at as many aspects of what we do as possible to think about what are the processes and procedures we put in place to have bias interrupters that are embedded in those systems. So auditing your hiring system, what are you doing in your hiring that could contribute to bias? Things we've done is making sure that we have interview questions that everyone is going to answer, trying to eliminate that familiarity of, oh, you went to that school, or you know so-and-so, or all of those things that create this bond and familiarity that can produce those sorts of biases that give other people less of a chance because they're not in that in-group. They didn't have access to those people, those places, etc. These are all things that feed into the biases. Looking at the people that you hire, is every single person that you've contracted with, is that are white people or people of color or people who are only in this area? What do your hiring practices look like for external folks? So for us at Elemental, we're taking a really, really hard look at our supplier diversity chain. Who are we hiring to do our photos for our team? Who are we hiring to help us out in different aspects or be experts? Like, what does that look like? It can go into even who are you going to hire to do your implicit bias training? Who is that person? Is it a person that just feels familiar and comfortable and is going to give you what you need? Or is it the person who's going to reflect people who might have these sorts of biases upon them, and really be able to dig a little bit deeper asking those questions? There's your contractors. Who are your contractors? Who are you working with? Who are your people? Do you have money in banks? And what are those banks looking like? Who are the people who are in charge of those banks? There are so many opportunities for you to take out biases in all these different ways that show your employees, that show your culture, and espouses that out. We've seen through 2020 that so many companies are like, we stand with Black Lives Matter, we do this. But for me, I'm like, that's great. You made that statement. Now show me what you're doing. Show me your budget. What does your budget look like? Your budget's going to show me your values and who that money is going to. So these are other things in addition to your implicit bias training that are going to actually help to change your culture and make folks believe that you are trying to make the change.
Yeah. And I think to combat the systemic issues that we have with racism in America, we need to proactively look at, I call it like the pipeline of diversity, right? So how are we, like in Hawaii, how are we getting more folks of color on the bench in Hawaii? You know, how are we getting more people, you know, Native Hawaiians, say, involved in the education process, becoming teachers, becoming professors, all that sort of stuff, because that has long range implications, because the next generation is saying that, hey, you know, this person that looks like me is doing that, I can do that too. You know, if you're in court and you see that, you know, we take students into the courtroom all the time, and, you know, 9 times out of 10, you go into a courtroom, it's going to be a white judge sitting there, usually a male judge that is sitting there. And so that is, in a way, that's reinforcing a bias that we have, that, you know, judges are white men, right? So what does that do then when you go into the courtroom, you bring a student into the courtroom and you see that it is, you know, a woman of Japanese ancestry sitting at the bench, or you see it's a Native Hawaiian sitting at the bench. You see it's, you know, to the space we get, it's someone who's transgender sitting at the bench or whatever. That's how we can interrupt those things on a system-wide basis, right? Looking at the pipeline, getting to the roots of that type of bias, and then going for diversity, getting different perspectives. And then that, I think, eventually changes the organization, whichever organization you happen to be speaking about. I think it does necessarily has an impact.
I would agree with the comments of both Jamila and Keahi. Maybe trying to bridge the two, or find a different connector between the two. I was thinking about, so this idea that Jamila is talking about, I think of as like this implicit bias audit. It's not just implicit bias, but it's really kind of a thoughtful top-down audit within an organization to think about what you're doing and why, right? Hiring's a big part, but not only. You think about the educational sector and schools, right? Keahi's talking about pipeline challenges, right? Implicit bias in schools is a huge topic. And maybe even a bigger topic here than in other, I mean, it's a huge topic in other places, but it's a very, very present topic in our schools. So you look at schools and you say, how do we do an audit within that, right? You do look at hiring, who's getting hired as teachers and why and how, who's getting selected within that pool if it's public schools to go to what school and why and how. And then you're also looking at how students are treated, right? What are the educational expectations that teachers have of their students and why? That is often bias driven. And then of course, disciplinary decisions, I think, is a more obvious one. But all these things just within one place, right? There's so much going on. Or public health, think of childbirth outcomes. When are C-sections used on, and why are there disproportionate rates of Micronesian women getting C-sections on, at for the same indicators when other women aren't? So you really have to go deep into these, and then pipeline is a way out, right? By ensuring that the pipeline works and counter stereotypes, but you have to really look deep within each organization.
Yeah, that actually is a good point. And I think in terms of, it sounds to me like it needs to be multifaceted, because if you're going to make institutional systemic change, how do you use the training, I guess is a question, to make institutional and systemic change? It sounds like it needs to be more than just personal, improving personal relationships within the workplace. Thoughts on that? One of the big questions.
Yes, there's personal reflection. Yes, there's personal accountability. But we're looking at this as more than just the personal accountability. It's like how this reverberates throughout society, how this affects our structures. And I think that's why the implicit bias training is something that a lot of folks see as like this introspection part of it. But the next steps that should come out of that are the active steps of you doing something, not just doing something for yourself, but doing something that helps to move the needle forward. And that's the important thing. That's the internal personal check on yourself, is the check to make sure that you don't perpetuate the systemic issues that continue to move forward. So this is why it is one tool, but not the only tool in order to move us all the way to where we need to be, because there wasn't just one tool that created all of these systems. There was a theory that helped to make all of these systems into the tools that help to, well, not help, that create these systems of bias. These are structural. They're not individual within a person. These are structural changes that we all have to continue to work for actively. And the only way that you can usually move people to move actively is for them to understand their role in it. And so these things help them to understand their role and how to help us collectively move forward.
A couple of questions have come up too about, how do you deal with people, the deniers, either the leadership who says it's not a problem in our organization, or the folks who say, I don't need to come to this, or, they're at the training, but they're not really engaged. Thoughts on how you bring along hearts and minds if they're, and organizations.
I don't want to take on all the stuff, but I feel like Justin has a very clear answer to this one.
Like, super clear. I was just waiting for Justin to say
mine might not be the right answer. That's the problem. I have an answer that I've been using, and I'm not sure it's the long-term answer, but it's a calculated answer. My answer has been that I just let them go. I mean, every time I've gone and I did a training at the 7th Circuit, all the 7th Circuit judges at some point, maybe 4 years ago. And I had some really uncomfortable elevator moments, and there's a big skyscraper. And my view is that there are going to be people where you just aren't going to make progress, and that it's not your job as a trainer. Now, if you're in the organization, it's a different question. But if you're a trainer or you're an educator, there are going to be people that just don't care and don't want to hear it. And then there'll be people that just forget it 10 seconds later. And my view has been that, at least until this point in history, that the number of people who are brought in by learning about this is still we still need to get there. And that those are the people that I really want to work with, because they're going to say, how do we audit this organization? And then you say, well, have you thought about this? Where's the discretion point? What about this person? What kinds of discretion do they have? Why do they have that? Right? That we haven't yet run out of those people to work with. So for me, it's really just been like, I don't desire to try to convince people who don't want to hear. That's as an outsider coming in. If you have those people within your organization, I think they need to be left behind within the organization. And I think they probably are already. So it doesn't mean there aren't going to be hard moments. I'm sure there are. But it just means that I wouldn't let progress be derailed by detractors. That's just a general thought.
Thanks. And I'm interested in Jamila and Keahi's views too of, some of these people you have to live with and work with. Okay, how do you deal with that? Do you?
Yeah, I think of course you have to deal with it. It's the politics of any type of organization, right? And when you're doing the training, you're going to have those people who you're preaching to the choir, who are with you from the start, and like, amen, brother. They're with you from word one. But then there's that group that it's going to be new information for them. It's going to make them very uncomfortable, but they are willing to make the effort, right? And they're engaged, and you can get a lot of those people on board to start to make effective change. But then there is that group that, it's just not gonna. They're either some words you say they're the laggards, they're the late adopters, or they're just not, they don't care at all, or they may be outright, may outright have animus or towards, the concept of implicit bias, or maybe racist, explicitly, and just don't want to have anything to do with the training that you're doing. And so you just have to deal with it on a regular basis. I think one of the things you can do as well on an individual basis is, sometimes it takes a bit of guts, but if you're in a specific interaction with someone or group of people, to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, I think the way we just phrased that, or you just phrased that, I got an issue with it. I'm going to tell you why. If you can give that feedback, you feel comfortable giving that feedback, that's great. I mean, of course, in certain situations, you're going to feel, oh wow, is what I'm going to say going to cause a big problem for me? But if you think you've got people within your organization that got your back, and then you can have that conversation in a way that is not going to be, hey, I'm going to put you down because of what you said, but hey, I'm going to let you know how that made me feel, or the impression that I got from what you said. I think that's one of the arts of that you've got to learn dealing in any organization, right? How do you criticize behavior that you think is not conducive to a diverse organization, that embraces diversity, that wants to include all sorts of people. And if you need to make people aware of what they're doing that's counter to that, then figure out the way to do it that's going to at least put it on the radar that, okay, I said something that, or I did something that at least it's on somebody's radar that what I did was not the right way to do it. And maybe that starts them to thinking about, well, is there a better way I could have done that, or that I could have said something? Or do I need to, hey, check myself and say, maybe I need to do another implicit bias test and see if I have, a particular bias towards this group of people or whatever.
I'll just say that I saw on Twitter, someone put it on Twitter this week that said implicit bias training is not going to change a racist. And so I really think that you just have to go in it with that's what it is. But if you're trying to change the culture of your organization, it's why you need leadership to buy in. Because if there's someone who is so wedded, so determined to continue to hold the beliefs that they hold, then leadership has to do something about that. If you have leadership buy-in, if someone does something that they don't mean to do, but is a teaching moment, then you're able to have that teaching moment and not be worried about losing your job or something else happening to you. So this is why it's so important that it is leadership buy-in, leadership running, leadership actually showing what there is to do. And sometimes on a personal level, you just have to decide what you want. I personally am done convincing people that I belong. I belong. Figure it out for you. It's not my job to figure that out for you. So I think that it's twofold. It's really having an organization that supports the fact that you're trying to move forward, but also being willing to let some people be left, because that might be just what's necessary.
Thank you. You know, we're nearing the 1 o'clock hour, and there are so many questions. It's really wonderful to see so many thoughtful questions, and people are being so engaged. I did want to point out at our organizer's suggestion that, you know, it's worth mentioning that everybody has implicit biases. I think you probably have picked that up. And what's really interesting, we'll send some links afterwards to some interesting resources, but one is the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, which is a series of little tests you can take to judge your own implicit biases. And in Hawaii too, Professor Levinson is working at the law school on a specific bias, implicit bias test that would be specific to Hawaii. Did you want to say anything about that, Professor?
Oh, thanks. I mean, it's not ready yet. The idea is for us to have kind of a Hawaii specific educational resource on the web where people can take demonstration tasks. They could address specific potential implicit and explicit biases here and learn about them, and also have a place for resources. It's something that I've been working on with collaborators for a while now, and we're getting across different units at the university with some really wonderful people. And so we're getting close. I guess I'll try to hurry it up. So I'm sorry, it's not ready yet, but hopefully before long.
We're looking forward to.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead, no, go ahead. I'm just saying, we're looking forward to it, but Jamila, go ahead.
Also looking forward to it, but I would also just point out and like shout out the Popolo Project, and they have a course called Understanding Race and Belonging in Hawaii. So this is Hawaii specific course on implicit bias, explicit bias, understanding the history of this place and understanding our roles within the whole space and how we move forward. So if you're also thinking about that, there's something that is out there that is ready, that can be tailored to what you need to make sure that we in Hawaii are really understanding how race shows up here and how those biases are manifesting and the why behind it.
Yeah, I think also mention, and this is another thing to go along with the Harvard implicit bias. There's another organization, the Corwin Institute out of the university, Ohio State University. They've been for years and years been doing work on implicit bias. You can check out their website. They have, basically they have a sort of video mini module training thing that they do online. It's just kind of, it's light, but it opens your eyes to some of the things if you've never heard of this sort of stuff before. Also mentioning, I've been reading a great book by Mahzarin Banaji and Tony Greenwald out of Harvard. And they're the folks who have been doing that implicit bias sort of stuff. But there's a book called Blind Spot that really gives you a little bit of the background with that and how the whole history of, you know, studying race relations, studying bias, the psychology behind it is so fascinating, I think. Yeah, so if you get a chance, check out some of that work as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is really just the beginning of a conversation. There's so much more to talk about, many more questions to answer, but I appreciate your time and your insights. And, you know, including people wanting to know just how we continue this impetus. It's great that we're focused on this now. Let's not let it get away. I understand that following up on these panel discussions, there will be some roundtables organized to really to drill into these issues further, which is wonderful. Before we turn it back to Professor Serrano, any parting thoughts before we leave this panel?
I do see one question here that I have a super quick answer to about how to explain to people about white supremacy when it's not only white people who are in power. And I think it's just important to say that not only white people are white people the perpetuators of white supremacy. It's a way that we are exposed to think. And so every single person, no matter their race, can be a tool of white supremacy. So that is the short of it.
Yeah, I think even if you do, one of the surprising things is that you might find if you do some of this, say the bias test, you might find that you hold biases that, you know, like me as an African-American person, I may have biases against African-American people, but that's because of the culture that I was brought up in. This American culture that says, you know, white is good, black is bad. And that is reinforced, you know, day after day in various different ways, you know, and the language that we use, the images that are shown, projected on in the media, in commercials, all that sort of stuff. We're bombarded by that constantly. And that does reflect in our unconscious.
Yeah,
Thank you. Go ahead.
I was just going to just add one last thing is just this big picture approach, right? That this is cultural. And so if you're part of a culture that perpetuates bias and you're not part of the solution, then you are part of the problem. And I think it's important for people to come to terms with that in their own way. But, you know, I've come to terms with that. And I think if you can come to terms with that, that'll really open up some doors for you.
Thank you so much, all of you. I hope this has really generated thinking and desires to act and, you know, pay attention to the announcements of the roundtables and, you know, look in yourself as well as organizationally and systemically on how we can all contribute to a more just society. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Professor Serrano for her concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. So I just want to extend a really sincere thank you to the panelists and to you, Louise, for your really thoughtful and engaging discussion on implicit bias trainings. These discussions lay such an important groundwork for our continued work, the difficult work on ways to address and eliminate bias in our organizations and our institutions and beyond. So I also want to let folks know about our next panel in the series called Diversity, Inclusion, and Empowerment. It's on March 12th at noon. It will explore diversity, inclusion in the legal community and the importance of creating institutional and organizational environments that empower people from diverse backgrounds. So the panel will feature Richardson Law School Dean Camille Nelson, attorney Bill Harrison, and policy advocate Jen Jenkins, and will be moderated by Ian Tapu. The registration link, I think, will be shared in the chat. Again, thank you so much to the panel and to all of you for sharing your time with us today. Aloha.